First and foremost, I want to thank you so much for taking out the time to stop by the platform. I really appreciate you doing that. And also, I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I really look forward to hearing more about it.
Terrific. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and it's really nice to meet you, and I'm impressed by the platform.
Definitely appreciate you. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are, where you're from, and definitely what do you do?
Okay, my name is Jonathan Hanson. I'm a senior lecturer in social studies at Harvard University. That's a fancy way of saying that I'm a historian trained in U.S. intellectual history, the history of ideas, but more recently writing books not about U.S. history, but about Cuban history and currently about the history of Rwanda. I'm working on a biography of Rwandan President Paul Kagame.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Now I can ask you this. When did you develop this passion for history? Is it something you were always interested in when you were younger, or did you kind of get into it later in life?
No, it's a really good question. I've always been interested in history. In my memory, it goes back to about seventh grade, and I had a teacher who, for one reason or another, inspired me to take an interest. And he would have really strange historical quizzes once a week at the beginning of class. And I would take great pride in trying to do as well as possible in those quizzes. And then in high school, I just had a couple of teachers who happened to be historians who were really good, and they inspired me, and they suggested to me that being a school teacher or eventually a historian might be a great thing to do. So it was really a matter of having mentors, some of my favorite teachers as historians, that got me into the field. And then by college, this pattern continued. I had some great historians teaching me in college and graduate school. And eventually, I wanted to contribute to the debates, not just read about the debates, but actually contribute to them and write my own books and teach my own classes. And that's what I'm doing now.
Wow, that's amazing. You know what I'm saying? You just could have one teacher that can inspire you or lead you on a path, plant a small seed, but obviously it came full circle. Now you teaching it and you writing books, you educating people on the history, which can be very empowering.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope I have a little influence on some of them anyway.
Yeah, definitely. Now I can ask you, what courses do you teach?
So at Harvard right now, I'm in this program called Social Studies, which was really an interdisciplinary undergraduate honors program with economists, historians, political theorists, sociologists, anthropologists, and so on. And I'm part of a big co-taught course called The History of Social Thought. It's called Social Studies 10, but it's a history of social and political thought going back years. And now it began, sort of as classic social and political thought, European, but now we have a host of different voices. And so we're trying to make it more diverse, more interesting, more up to date. So that's one course. And then I teach a course there called Justice and Reconciliation After Mass Violence, and it's connected to my work in Rwanda. And this course is a small seminar for interested students who want to engage both theoretical work on how countries have typically tried to reconcile from trauma, and then also a series of case studies with the US Civil War, recently the Troubles in Ireland, and then finally a case study on Rwanda, of which I'm working on now.
Wow, okay. Like I said, I don't know if I told you, I'm currently in Africa. I'm in Ghana. I've been to about 20 African countries. I had the opportunity to visit Rwanda. It's definitely the cleanest place I've seen in Africa for sure. It's a beautiful place.
When were you there, Taye?
I think that was last year. I was there for about 2 weeks. No, 2023, I was there.
What else did you notice besides the cleanliness?
Oh no, that was the main focus. I mean, the people were beautiful, friendly, beautiful culture. I went to the Genocide Museum. There was some performances, some plays, some music, some acting going on.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that 30 years ago that place had been the victim of a genocide with having lost up to 1 million people and having no institutions left, everything in tatters. And to think of the rebuilding they did really exceeds expectations and predictions. Um, I first became interested in Rwanda in 2010 because my wife is a physician at Boston Children's Hospital. and a group called Partners in Health, and their leader, Paul Farmer, who was a friend of ours, sadly, he passed away, asked my wife to come and introduce a neonatal newborn medicine protocol to the country. And in 2010, when we arrived, we went with our three kids and we lived for a summer in the east in a rural area, rural part of Rwanda in a very small village. And 2010, our trip coincided with a big report by the UN saying what a disaster Rwanda was and what a tyrant Paul Kagame is. And I was open to it. I didn't know much about Rwanda at the time. I was writing a book on Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And I said, okay, well, I'll take a look around, see what happens. But the time I spent there, those 3 months, I saw a really different story. I saw Rwandans working together at many, many different levels across race and gender, ethnicity, class, administrative hierarchy, you name it, working together on common projects. And as I put it to myself, I thought, it seems like in Rwanda right now, common work is contributing to a common weal, a common sense of social solidarity, and really inspiring a profound sense of hope that this cut against everything I'd been hearing and reading from that UN report, but other things too. And I just thought that the picture of Rwanda, what's going on in Rwanda, must be much more complicated than what I was hearing about it. And then we've been back every year since with my wife's work originally, except for one during COVID. And then as my most recent book on Fidel Castro, another long story, was nearly complete, I started to talk to some people in the president's office in Rwanda about the possibility of doing a book on Paul Kagame. I like to work on people that I think are caricatured in much of the Western media, especially like Castro. People love him or they hate him, and I was interested in the messy middle where human beings actually live our lives, right? And the same with Kagame. Kagame is both loathed among the NGO and human rights communities and many people in the United States and elsewhere, but he's also loved by many and appreciated, in for the kind of things you saw when you were there. But both of those poles, I think, are caricatures, and they miss the middle, the complexity where, again, where we live our lives. And I set out to write a history of Rwanda that captured all that. In my mind, what's going on there is unprecedented in human history. Rwandans trying to recover from the double whammy of colonialism and genocide. And it's a titanic, extremely difficult piece of work, maybe as difficult as anything could ever be. And if that's the case, doing the work is going to be as difficult as anything could be. It's going to be messy at times, it's going to be brutal, it's going to be successful, there'll be failures, they'll get criticism, they'll get some praise. But it's all of that that I'm trying to capture. I think of history as an exercise in moral imagination. And I'm trying to get readers, and I did this with Castro book too, to suspend judgment temporarily for understanding. That is, to not judge until they know, and to actually put themselves in the place of these people that we write about and ask readers, challenge readers to say, okay, imagine if you were in this person's shoes. What would you have done? What were the real options, not the ideal options that we gin up in Washington, London, Paris, and Munich, right? But what were the real options available to this person when he made this choice or this choice? If there was a massacre, what do you think precipitated that massacre? And it's a really difficult process and it takes a lot of work. And, I don't pretend to be able to do it perfectly, but I strive to do it as nearly as perfectly as possible, as humanly possible, despite my own biases and presuppositions.
Wow, that's some incredible work. And definitely, I take my hat off to Rwanda. Like you said, I never could imagine that this was the same place, that I seen the video footage of, like you say, a million people being massacred and how they were able to, try to move forward and reconcile and things like that. But I can ask you this. Now, you studying the language as well?
Yes, I am.
Oh,
Ndimo kwigiti in Rwanda. That means I'm studying Rwanda, Burimunsi, right now, every day, by Zoom from Boston to Kigali. I have a teacher. I had my class this morning at 7 a.m., by the way. I get up at 5 o'clock or so to do my umukoro, my homework. It's a really difficult language. I had to learn Spanish for the Castro and Guantanamo books. And that worked pretty much. I could do all my own translations. I could speak, not perfectly, but well enough. I wasn't living there. I was visiting all the time. It's really difficult, as you know, to learn a language when you're not living in a place. But that worked. But I don't even expect necessarily to master this. Kinyarwanda is a Bantu language, and it's exceedingly difficult. They have 16 different cases of nouns that all affect every verb that follows or that is used in sentences. And I'm getting it. I love the work. I understand the grammar, but to hear Rwandan speak is difficult for me because, of course, they speak comfortably and quickly, and they speak in slang, and it's I don't know, it's a Herculean task, and I'm trying to do it. And I love the language, and at my age, we got to work out our synapses. But I'm not sure I'll ever really get it. I love trying.
Wow, that's amazing because a lot of times I guess the reader we take for granted the amount of work that an author puts into a book. We might get 300 pages, but you putting in years and years and also learning the language, that's probably something that the reader probably would never conceive like, oh, okay, you took years to learn how to even know the
Yeah.
basics. That's truly amazing. Now I can ask you this one more question. Um, have you considered doing maybe like a documentary or even a film or anything like that based upon either your work in Rwanda or,
Yes.
in Cuba?
For sure. I had some interest in it. It kind of faded because, things come and go very quickly with the Castro book. I was in conversation with ABC, among others, to do a sort of mini series. And then there was some talk and some interest from some people in Hollywood. And that sort of faded. And I just was using, devouring too much energy to sort of like, is this going to work? Is this going to work? Following up. So I just let that go. But I am in conversation. It's a little early to say. I'm still writing the book. Literally this semester, I'm on leave. It's a little too early to say whether the Kagame book would become a film. But his life is unbelievable. The story I'm going to tell you cannot imagine it literally, just as Castro's was. I mean, I brought new life to Castro's life, things that we hadn't known before by focusing on his youth. Same with Kagame, like you wouldn't believe what the guy was doing his whole, as a child, as a youth, and what he suffered from and what he was able to do despite that. So yes, I have a friend who's a documentary filmmaker in Rwanda, Eric Kabera, who's a wonderful filmmaker, and he's interested. We've talked about this tentatively. Others have talked about it. I have a friend who is a former Rwandan soldier during the genocide who wants to maybe co-write a drama about Rwanda with me. I don't even know. He won't tell me. He said, I can't tell you about it until you finish the work. But yes, I'm quite interested in that. I mean, always, right? The more, the more ways we can get out our message, the better.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. And I visited Cuba maybe 2 or 3 times as well, and I can speak for experience like growing up in America. Every picture I ever seen of Castro, he always has on the military uniform. He always has on green. He's always energetic. But when I visited Cuba, they would show pictures of him swimming at the beach or playing basketball or doing different things like that. And then, like you say, as a human, you kind of try to find the middle ground and really figure out.
Absolutely. It was the Castro that's, frothing at the mouth that I was trying to suspend. We all know what Castro looks like. Let me quickly do a share and just show you the cover of the book. This is just taken right off the web, right? But do you see this guy here? Can you see that? That's the guy that I'm trying to capture, whose story I was trying to tell. He is not the person he became. And he became who he became for really complicated reasons that I talk about in the book. But it was a kid who grew up in a really isolated plantation in eastern Cuba. His parents were absolutely dirt poor, but became quite rich because his father was an unbelievable worker. His father came to Cuba as a young Spaniard soldier to end the Cuban War of Independence, right? He then went home after the US defeated the US and Cuba, but really the US defeated Spain. And then he realized that, wow, that's a mess over there in Cuba now after the Spanish-American War. so-called Spanish-American War, right? The Cuban War of Independence. But there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done. So he came right back and he worked in mines in eastern Cuba and he worked in different forms of agricultural work and other kind of carting and carrying stuff, transporting stuff by oxen all over. He just worked and worked and worked. And when Castro grew up, he had a plantation that covered tens of square miles, 42 square miles, I think, of some of Eastern Cuba's most fertile territory, adjacent to all the great American and other United Fruit Company farms. And he worked with them. This was Castro's dad. He got along. You know, he was very different from them, right? But he got along with them. He made things work. And this is the young kid whose story I was trying to tell. Like, wow, we don't know any of that. When did he become so anti-American? Was he always like this? The answer is absolutely not. He spent his honeymoon in America, lived up on the Upper West Side of New York. I don't know if you're aware of that. And you know, and I think really looked up to America. But during the revolution, I tell the story in the book. You know, he wanted more than anything else. He wanted Cuba to be autonomous and independent, and from any government, but the American government in particular, he wanted recognition of Cuba as its own country, respect and reciprocity. He wanted to work with them. And when the US tried to take out the revolution, and I have it in the book, in the fall of 1958, just as it was about to succeed, right? Castro was aware of this and he turned against the United States and he eventually, right, embraced communism. But he wasn't a communist. Che was, his brother Raul was, he was surrounded by them, but he was a pragmatist, a nationalist. He wanted a free and independent Cuba. And so it's that story I tell in the book, then making sense of why he became communist. And I argue in the book that he turned to communism as a marriage of convenience, not as a marriage of commitment. He went there because the US started to invade, and there was no, he hadn't been able, because of the how quickly he won the revolution, to establish a political platform capable of sustaining his military platform. He was trying and he was working with many talented people to do it, but he wasn't able to do it. So when the US came in to crush the revolution, he reached out to the only show in town, which was the Communist Party, and you know, and then with U.S. Russian support, Soviet support, and other things, he was able to sustain this in a very broken way. And I argue that you know he literally, I mean, this isn't quite fair. Well, I'll put this colloquially, that he kind of lost his mind. He you know, he just got so ballistic at the fact that the U.S. tried to shut this down, that then, you know, we became the devil. And then once converted to communism, he became more communist than the Pope. You know, he became a devoted communist. So that's the story I tell in that book. It's another book, you know, full of I mean, a book that takes on the misconceptions that we try, you know, that we hold in the West about who he is. Just like I think we hold a lot of misconceptions about who Kagame is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I appreciate you sharing that information. That definitely is an interesting book. I'm gonna have to check it out. Hopefully the viewers will as well. Now I can ask you this. Did you receive any I guess pushback from either side? You know, because when you speak about Castro, it's kind of like a touchy subject for a lot of people.
To say the least. And so, by the way, is Kagame, as you probably know. I mean, absolutely as much. And Castro's dead, but Kagame's not. So, but yes, I mean, you know, to be perfectly honest, I expected more pushback. And I feel like in some ways maybe the book was too successful. That is the not in sales, but in its mission to reset the historiography on the young Castro, because I had an absolute ocean of evidence, much of it never seen before by any historian. And I did this by convincing the Cuban government they could trust me. And it was my Guantanamo book that, you know, they thought was fair. I didn't owe them anything. I didn't ask any favors. I just said, can I have access to the archives? It took me 3 or 4 years to get into those archives, by the way, in Cuba. But once in, I got a ton of stuff. I can't say everything because I don't know what they were withholding, but not just from them, but from others. I got letters that no one had seen before between him and a lover, things like this. And so, yeah, I thought, oh no, I'm going to get murdered when this book comes out. And in fact, despite all the people in Miami who would hate such a book, it was hard to push back on. Reviews, but scholarly reviews were generally very positive. There are always some people who say on Amazon, "Oh, the guy's a hack. Hansen doesn't know anything. Castro's a monster." That's fine. I expected that. But to be really honest, I thought there would be more controversy. As you know, controversy sells books, and so I needed some of that. I don't think there'll be any doubt that if I pull off this Kagame book, there will be controversy because it's still live. I don't know if you know this, but Rwanda is still surrounded by people in countries trying to finish the job, trying to take Kagame out and complete the genocide. And I'm not making that up. After the genocide, France came in and intervened and basically ushered the genocidaires straight into these refugee camps in different countries. And then they began right away to rearm themselves, basically running those refugee camps. And then some of them, the most vulnerable to arrest when they went to European countries and other countries in Africa. And they're still around. There's some people who have, come to think grudgingly, perhaps, that, there may be something going on in Rwanda right now that's worth supporting. But there's still a lot of people who want to, overthrow this government and finish the job. So talk about fraught. If this book succeeds, I'm gonna get it. But that's okay. I mean, that's part of what I like to do, and what I take on is try to get, as I say, the middle, the messy middle where most of us live our lives.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Because, like I said, I traveled around Africa. So when you do speak of Rwanda or the president, you may speak to somebody from the Congo or Uganda, and what their
Oof.
perspective or perception of him is can be totally different from somebody from, the West or America. So, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, now I wanted to ask you this as well. Like you said, Castro is no longer living. Have you seen some type of reconciliation or change between the relationship in Cuba and America? Because it seemed like for one moment it was like, okay, you could travel to Cuba, then it was like, no, you can't
Yeah.
travel no more. Then I don't know where it's at.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's a really sad situation. When I was there doing all that research and about, once I got in and things were really cooking, it was about 2015, 16, 17. And that was during up to 2016, the Obama rapprochement, right? They had opened up diplomatic relations with Cuba. I know well the person who was the chargé at the U.S. Embassy. He would have been the ambassador, but the U.S. Senate won't approve an ambassador to Cuba. It's part of our dislike for Cuba and U.S. longstanding U.S. policy. Um, but yeah, so at that time we were all helpful. I had Cuban friends, and by this time I had met so many because I was flying down there all the time to do the research, who were dusting off resumes. We've all heard about the taxi drivers who are so-called engineers, right? Who are driving taxis because there's no work and no engineering going on in Cuba. So I had friends, Cuban friends, I would attempt to say hundreds, who were so hopeful about doing things, and US people too, and even some people in Miami. Things were really looking up. Many, many people in both countries, both communities, the exile community and the community in Cuba. And it just, Trump came in and shut down the rapprochement, and then COVID struck. And between those two things, it's devastated the Cuban economy. Cuba is somewhat used to US policy changing, getting a little looser, getting a little tighter over time, but no one is used to COVID. And the Cuban economy, as you know, you probably know, is dependent upon remittances, people here sending money back, but also on tourism. And even if Americans couldn't go, well, you could go if you were from South America, you go from Cuba, I mean, from Canada, you could go from Europe, and people did all the time. The place boomed ever, as you know, but it was doing pretty well when Trump and COVID intervened. And right now it's devastating. There's more exiles there, people leaving Cuba than I think have left maybe ever, but certainly since the Mariel period. And so it's really, really sad. I was down there. I took my family down there for Christmas 2 Christmases ago. And it wasn't the place I remembered. I saw some friends and they were holding on. The Cubans are tough. They're resilient. They're used to it, getting hit. But this hit is devastating. And some of the great artists that I knew and had befriended, some of the great musicians I knew and had befriended are all out of Cuba. So we couldn't go here and meet the people I was hoping to meet, although I could probably meet them in Boston or New York.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, now I think you might have touched on it, but if you could speak about Guantanamo and American history, now what exactly is that about?
Yeah, yeah, good question. Well, so again, I told you I was trained as a U.S. intellectual historian. I wrote my first book about American civic identity 100 years ago. It's a period, that seems so different from ours, but wasn't so different from ours. It was a period of demographic upheaval, migrants coming into the country, civil rights agitation, gender agitation, labor unrest. So everyone thought that the country had become unhinged and we had lost a sense of ourselves, right? And you can imagine the old Anglo-Saxon WASP elite was really worried, just as I think some of the white folk are today in America, and they're looking, hoping to sort of buckle down and recover the old America. And then there were others who were saying, like we have a lot of problems, but we could fix them, and diversity and immigrant migration and civil and the plight of African Americans, Black Americans, isn't their presence here isn't a problem. It's their plight that's bad, and that we should include them. So I wrote a book about W.B. Du Bois and Eugene Debs, the socialist leader, Jane Addams, the feminist leader, and John Dewey, some of the other philosophers who were arguing for an encompassing definition of what it meant to be American at the time, and saying that diversity is our strength. We should harness this. It's a resource. We can be an unusual nation in the world because we have this diversity. And so that book came out in 2003, and I was just setting up to do another book. I had a fellowship in Boston, and the Guantanamo stories broke. The fact that we were holding those detainees there from the War on Terror, if you remember, and they had no habeas rights, no rights whatsoever. And there was a lot of outrage, and people were trying to understand, well, A, what is this weird place, Guantanamo, and why are we taking these people there from Afghanistan? That seems a weird place to take some people. And why don't they have any rights at all? Like this seemed like an anomaly in the world legal system. And I knew a little bit about when we got Guantanamo because it was part of that first book, because the first book included some chapters on US imperialism. And it included the time in 1898 when we took Guantanamo from Cuba during the Spanish-American War. So when the Bush administration was arguing, publicly in the Supreme Court, these detainees have no habeas rights because that's American law, right? Because Guantanamo is property of Cuba. I knew enough to say, well, de facto, yes, but de jure, no, because we run that place. We occupy Guantanamo. And that in fact there's no national law there, no Cuban law, no US law, no international law, because it's a sacred little spot where we can do whatever we want to whomever we want. And I wrote an op-ed on that in the New York Times the day the Rasool case, it was called, went to court in April 2003. And I got a lot of attention. People read the New York Times. They said, "Oh, forget whatever you're doing now. Write a book about Guantanamo Bay." And so I said, okay. And I began to work on this project. I'll just tell you one little story that I think will give you a sense. What I found was I expected the story to be interesting, maybe going back 10 years to the War on Terror, right? And then I expected it to be going back, well, maybe 100 years to when we took Guantanamo in 1898. But what I found is Guantanamo is deep in American history since really the beginning. I don't know if you know this, but have you ever been to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home site in Virginia? No? Okay, well, Mount Vernon, one of our sacred shrines, national shrines, right, is named after a British admiral, Edward Vernon, the George Washington's half-brother, served in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for 3 months in 1741. And in that book, I have I have Lawrence Washington, Jefferson's half brother, actually sort of hoping that the British then, because we weren't the United States at the time, these were Americans, but British soldiers. I have him sort of hoping, licking his lips over maybe establishing Mount Vernon in Santiago de Cuba. And I'm not making it up. I can make the case for it. It's a good case. I have the documents. And so what is it? Like, why? Why were Americans down in Guantanamo in 1741? Well, it had to do with the vision of America as a nation. here we were, this country, right? That was this, not this country, but this set of colonies that was smashed up against the Atlantic Ocean on the one hand, and the Appalachian Mountains on the other, the Appalachian Range. On the other side of the Appalachian Range were the Indians and the French. And the Spanish dominated the seas. And there was just a sense that this little colony is getting smashed and we need to expand. And so these guys were hoping to expand. Now, a couple of interesting facts over time. George Washington's father was a surveyor. Thomas Jefferson's father was a surveyor. Benjamin Franklin was an investor. All these guys wanted to invest in the territory across the Appalachians into what's now the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, right? But if you want to, they want to invest in that. Why? Because it could become, they knew it could become the breadbasket of America. But if you're hoping to invest in that, you have to control not only those territories, but you have to control the seaways, the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. And you need to control where the Mississippi runs into, the Gulf of Mexico. And you need to control the area where the water flows into the Gulf of Mexico, right? Which is actually because of in the age of wind and sail through the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti, on which sits Guantanamo Bay. So Guantanamo commands, it's the one deep harbor, big deep harbor there on the Windward Passage. It commands the access to America. It really, I say in the book, is sort of the key to the Atlantic trade because, again, of how things work in the age of wind and sail and current. And I'm not making it up. All of these guys knew it. Jefferson knew it. Washington knew it. Franklin knew it. John Quincy Adams knew it. America, we used to talk about it long before we took it in 1898 as, an essential piece of American property that we have to at one point get. Not necessarily Guantanamo, but Cuba. But Guantanamo was an essential part of that, and these guys knew exactly that. So in the introduction to that book, I have Jefferson looking out the front of Monticello down onto the Piedmont when those happy slaves working away for him, right? And thinking, this is fantastic. And then I have him going out the back of Guantanamo and looking over the huge, imagining the huge amount of land into the sort of Midwest, into the breadbasket, and actually seeing Cuba. And he writes about that in his work, in his notes on the state of Virginia. He knows exactly how important Cuba is and imagines that once in a period of glacialization, I don't know how you say that word, that in fact it was that Cuba was part of North America when the seas were lower. So these guys wanted Cuba, and that book is essentially a book about American empire and American empire building and how we use this place over time. So it's really the biography of a place that then leads me to do the biography of a person, Castro, and then now another biography of Kagame.
Wow, that's really amazing. I really appreciate that and sharing it and breaking it down. It makes a lot of sense. So I want to ask you for the viewers who want to check out some of your previous work and they want to keep up with what you're doing, if they want to pre-order or be up to date with the up and coming project, what's the best way for them to do that? Do you have a website or should they go to Google, Amazon?
Yeah, I have a website that's jonathanmhanson.com. I mean, it's getting a little stale, but you can see my work for there for sure. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to just I'm a little reluctant to just give you my email over the but I can easily be found at Harvard. Jonathan Hanson, you can find my email. I mean, it's available. It's jhanson at fas.harvard.edu. It's readily available. No problem. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, this has been a phenomenal episode. And like I say, I apologize for the delay, but I
No, not
really
at all.
appreciate you taking the time to stop by.